We've seen over the last 8 weeks, as you've heard me say before, that Genesis does not tell the story of good people who do great things. It tells the story of great sin that is met with an even greater grace. That's what we've seen so far. Through all of the familiar stories that we've read, through all of the familiar stories that we've looked at, that's what we've seen. We've seen great sin met with an even greater grace. In fact, what we've discovered is it's not about the best people making it up to God, it's about God making it down to the worst people. That's what we see as we've made our way through these stories, and we've seen this over and over and over again, that God meets rebellion with rescue. He meets sin with salvation. He meets guilt with grace. He meets badness with goodness. I mean, the Bible tells us in 1,000 different ways that we are failing sinners and God is a successful Savior. That's what the Bible is intended to show us. That is the storyline of the Bible. Over and over and over again, from Genesis to Revelation, what we discover is that we are failing sinners and that God is a successful Savior. If you read the Bible and come up with anything different than that, you're not reading the Bible the way God intends for us to read the Bible. That is the storyline of the Bible, and we've seen that throughout Genesis so far, throughout these numerous chapters. The fact of the matter is, when we fail to believe this, when we fail to believe this storyline, that we are failing sinners and God is a successful Savior, we take matters into our own hands, and as you know, life becomes a burden that we can't carry, a burden that we were never meant to carry. So God repeatedly reminds us how powerless we are to save ourselves and to make it on our own. In love, He constantly reminds us that He is God and we are not, that we are much more incapable than we think we are, but that He is much more capable than we could ever hope for or imagine. And we've discovered that as we've made our way through the familiar stories of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah, the Tower of Babel, and even as we've made our way through the Abraham narrative. And so we get this reminder again here in the famous story of Abraham and his son Isaac. And I dare say that we would be very, very, very hard-pressed. You and I would be very, very hard-pressed to find an Old Testament story that more explicitly gives us the gospel narrative than this one. I mean, all of the themes that we find in the narrative of the gospel are here. A loving father, an only son, a substitutionary sacrifice, and a resurrection. We get all of that here. I mean, and it's not given here implicitly, it's given here explicitly. And so while all of the Old Testament points to Jesus, while all of the Old Testament crescendos in Jesus, while all of the Old Testament foreshadows Jesus, there are certain places in the Old Testament, like this one, which so explicitly gives us the themes of the gospel that we just can't miss it. It's all here. And this story, in a real sense, is a promise of another loving father and another only son and another substitutionary sacrifice and another resurrection. Now, when you read this story, initially it throws you for a loop. I mean, it's strange, okay? I mean, there's all kinds of things in this story that just don't make a whole lot of sense and compute initially. First of all, you have God commanding human sacrifice. And that makes you go, wait a second. I mean, from the beginning of the world, God has always frowned upon human sacrifice, and now this God is commanding human sacrifice. That doesn't make sense. But even more than that, we just finished looking at last week how God promised that 90-year-old barren Sarah and 100-year-old Abraham would have a baby who would become a nation that would bless the whole world. And as crazy and as impossible as this first sounded to them, God made good on His promise. God met their deadness with the gift of life. Okay, I mean, God makes this promise long before Isaac's born that He was going to give Abraham and Sarah a son, and through that son, God would birth a nation, and through that nation, God would bless the world. And Abraham's like, I'm 100, she's 90, she's barren. Okay, I mean, we don't have a measly kid, much less a nation. Well, God makes good on his impossible promise. And we read in chapter 21, verses 1 to 2, the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham. The impossible promise came true. God brought life out of death. And now, just a few years later, okay, it doesn't say how old Isaac is here, but, I'm guessing did you ever see that movie, The Bible? Okay, long time ago, George C. Scott played Abraham. I mean, Isaac looked about 10 or 11, okay? So let's just say, if the movie's correct, that's about the age that Isaac is. So you're just talking a few years later, God comes to Abraham and tells him that he wants him to go kill his son. And you're like, no, this doesn't make any sense. Okay? I mean, God makes this promise. He calls Abraham out of his homeland, and he brings him out in the desert, basically. And Abraham's getting old, and Sarah's getting old, and Sarah's burdened. She is burdened by the fact that she's barren. Sarah's barren, and God makes this promise, and finally this promise comes true, and now it's just a few years later. And God says, go take this boy that I've given you and kill him. Okay? Doesn't make sense. And just to make sure that Abraham feels the weight of this demand, it's almost as if God rubs it in. Okay? And look at what he says in verse 2. Take your son, your only son, the one that you love. Okay? I mean, he wants Abraham to feel the weight of this demand. Take your son, your only son, the one that I promise you, the one that you love, and kill him. That's what I want you to do. Now, we don't read, the Bible just doesn't tell us anything about Abraham's immediate reaction. I mean, just doesn't see fit to tell us what his I would love to know what his immediate reaction was when God comes and tells him this. Take your son, your only son, the one that I promised you, the one that a great nation is going to be birthed from, the one that will bless the entire world. Yeah, that one. You know that one? Take him. Go kill him. Okay, now I would love to have known what his immediate reaction was. Interestingly, the Bible doesn't tell us what his immediate reaction was. It doesn't tell us anything about it. It only records that he got up the next morning, took Isaac, and went. Now that's important, I think, for this reason. For whatever reason, there is no record of an argument, a fight, not even a record of Abraham questioning God. I don't know what his immediate reaction was, but the Bible sees fit only to record that the next morning, Abraham gets up, takes his son, and goes. Okay? Just crazy. I would have probably put up a little bit of a fight. I might have even said, no, I'm not going to do that. I might have even concluded that the voice that I was hearing was not God, but the devil, okay? Because God never sanctions and commands human sacrifice. But Abraham gets up the next morning early, takes his son, and goes. Now, what that means is this, okay? Just a few years earlier, God makes this crazy promise, and God makes good on this promise. He fulfills this promise, and that promise fulfilled created a faith in Abraham that gave him eyes to see. All right, look at verse 7 and 8. Chapter 22, verse 7 and 8. This is interesting. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father, and he said, here am I, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. Just robust faith. I don't understand what God is doing. I cannot trace his hand in this. But because he made good on this impossible promise before, I can trust his heart in this. And then notice what he says in verse 5, okay? Then Abraham said to his young men, the two companions that went with him on this trip, along with Isaac, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. Okay, there was some measure of confidence that both he and the boy were coming back. Now flip over to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19. The writer to the Hebrews is recalling this event, this famous story. And it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So it tells us, the writer to the Hebrews tells us right there what was going on in Abraham's mind. Okay, this fulfilled promise that God would give he and Sarah a son created faith that gave him eyes to see the impossible. And it's not as if, Abraham had been on the receiving end or had been an eyewitness to a whole lot of resurrections up until that point. But for whatever reason, because of God's fulfilled promise, Abraham was given by God a faith to see, to believe the impossible. And Hebrews tells us that, Abraham believed at some level that God was going to raise him from the dead, that he would go through the act of killing his son, and then God would bring him back to life. That's what Abraham apparently thought was going to happen. God has made and fulfilled this impossible promise before the birth of Isaac, and the obedience of Abraham here is nothing other than faith in the God who raises the dead. Now, there's something else that I think is really important to point out. It is this promise from God that creates Abraham's faith, not some heroic human virtue. Okay? Abraham's obedience, in other words, is not the fruit of Abraham's movement toward God, but God's movement toward Abraham. It's really, really important because oftentimes as we live the Christian life, for those of you who are Christians, as we live the Christian life, we can think about the Christian life in terms primarily of our movement toward God. But what we discover throughout the Bible is that the Christian life is birthed and sustained as a result of God's movement toward us. Descending one-way love is what not only gets us in, but it's what keeps us in. Otherwise, if we don't understand that, then we could read Abraham's response. He gets up the next morning and he takes his son and he goes and think, wow, Abraham really is a super saint. He's got something I don't got. He really, really is a spiritual giant. And we begin to categorize people, If we think that the Christian life is our movement toward God instead of God's movement toward us, we begin to categorize people. We have degrees of Christian maturity. So this person's a big deal spiritually and this person's not. Paul, ironically, the Apostle Paul, identifies real spiritual maturity at the bottom, not the top. I'm the least of all the saints. I'm the worst guy that I know, he says at the end of his life. Demonstrating that the Christian life is not first and foremost about our getting better and better and better and better. Or let me qualify that and say, maybe the Christian life is about our getting better and better and better, but then let's define what it means to get better. What it means to get better is to realize I'm small, God's big. I'm nothing, He's everything. That's what it means. When we stop obsessing over our need to improve, that is what the Bible means by improvement, okay? And so we see that here. We see this radical obedience, this radical response to God's crazy command, this demand. And we could easily walk away and go, Abraham's a big deal, okay? But if we do that, we miss the fact that living faith, the faith that only God gives, believes that the God who makes the demand also meets the demand. So what do we see here in the story? We see Abraham's radical response, this response of obedience. As a result of the gift of faith, Abraham's response is the fruit of this gift that God had given him, this gift of faith that he had given him. And then what we see is that God not only makes this crazy demand, take your son, your only son, the one whom you love, the one that I promised, and go kill him. God not only makes this demand and makes Abraham feel the weight of this demand by reminding him, this is your only son, you know. This is the one that I promised. This is the one that you love. I want you to feel it. I want you to feel the weight of what I'm asking you to do. Not only makes the demand, but then one of the most beautiful parts of the story, of course, is the angel of the Lord stops Abraham, and Abraham looks up and God provides a substitute sacrifice, a ram. So what is this story really about? Okay. I mean, all of that's fascinating and it's good material. It's all true material. It's good. But I mean, what is this story really about? This is the story of God doing for us what we could never do for ourselves. It's a story of the cross. It's a story of the resurrection. Both those things, the cross and the resurrection, are promised here because years later, another only son would climb another hill carrying wood on his back. And on that hill, a substitutionary sacrifice would take place, as would a resurrection 3 days later. Life from death. His death, our life. What we find here in this story is a substitutionary sacrifice. And what we discover is that God, in a very real sense, as Hebrews tells us, gives Isaac his life back. Okay? Isaac gets his life back because of a sacrificial substitute that we find here in the ram. God making a demand of sinners and God meeting that demand for sinners. Now, let's get this on the ground of your life and mine. Okay, this is the best news imaginable. This idea that the God who makes the demands also meets the demands is the best news imaginable because we feel the weight of demand every single day in 1,000 different ways. You and I feel it, okay? We feel the weight of demand in 1,000 different ways every single day. I mean, the demands of life are numerous. Infomercials promising a better life if you work at getting a better body. A neighbor's new car, a beautiful person, the success of your coworker. All of these things have the potential to communicate you're not enough. It's amazing how powerful billboards and advertisements can be in communicating you're not enough. Do more. Try harder. If you really want your best life now, you have to do X, Y, and Z. You have to become X, Y, and Z. Okay, we feel that. We feel the demand in 1,000 different ways. Recently, I told you this a number of months back, but recently I was driving down the road and I passed a sign in front of a store that read, "Life is the art of drawing without an eraser." Okay? And I thought to myself, listen, I know that's meant to inspire drivers to live well, the people driving by to live well and to avoid mistakes, but it served as a booming voice of law to everyone that read it. Don't mess up. There are no second chances. You better get it right the first time. Okay? That's what it meant to communicate. This world is full to the brim with law. With the voice of accusation, with the voice of demand. We feel it in our homes. We feel it in our relationships. We feel it out there and we feel it in here. We feel it everywhere. Sounded like a Dr. Seuss line, didn't it? Somebody write that down. I'll tweet that later. We feel it, okay? We feel the demand. We hear the voice of accusation. You're not enough. You have to do more. You have to become something different. Change is the name of the game. Don't be satisfied with who you are or where you are. Change is the name of the game. And there are 1,000 different voices out there telling us how to change so that we can be happy and free. Okay? We feel it. We experience it. Husbands, you feel it from your wives, and wives, you feel it from your husbands. You know, especially inside the church. We're just so addicted to fixing things and fixing people and fixing one another. You know, I mean, we're so good at offering counsel and advice when someone's going through something difficult. You know, you may have good intentions. You know, you may have very good intentions. You're going through something difficult and you go to a friend, and this particular friend gives you a checklist of things that you can do to get out of the painful circumstances you're in. Or maybe you're having trouble with your children and you go and you talk to an older friend whose children are gone. And you know, this older friend says, I've been there, I've done that, here are all of the things you need to do. As well-intentioned as that is, does that not feel like a voice of accusation? Okay, you walk away from those conversations and you feel weaker. You feel like, I can't do it. Okay, we feel the weight of these demands all day, every day. Become this. You know, it's amazing to me. I'm a preacher, okay? I'm a pastor, which means I'm remarkably godly and incredibly holy, but even us super spiritual giants, all right? I'm kidding, of course, okay? Some of you guys, I don't think any of you who know me actually believe that, but some of you all wish that were true, but it's not. Let me assure you it's not true. But it's amazing how even preachers can hear other sermons where the preacher preaches a great sermon and it becomes a voice of accusation. You're not as good as that guy, okay? You know, I mean, it can be true for all of us in whatever field you're in, okay? It could be the field of finance, it could be the field of business, it could be the field of politics. It doesn't matter. Okay, law, whatever. I mean, whatever your field is, or maybe you're a mom, okay, and your kids are spinning out of control, and this woman has perfect children, okay? And just the fact, this woman may not say anything to you like, if you would do more what my husband and I do, your kids could be more like mine. Maybe she doesn't even say that, but just her very existence, all right? And her perfect children, in light of the fact that your children are imperfect, becomes a booming voice of law, accusation. Okay, maybe you're not married and you would love to be. And you have friends who are married. And even though they don't say anything ever about the fact that, hey, I think I found someone for you. Maybe they stopped trying to set you up a long time ago. But just being around them sometimes can feel like a booming voice of law. Because the very presence of their marriage reminds you that there must be something wrong with you by the very fact that you're not married, okay? I mean, we see it all the time. We experience it all the time. This demand. Abraham felt it. Take your son, your only son, the son whom you love, and kill him. God wanted Abraham to feel the weight of this demand. He wanted him to feel the crazy weight of this demand. When we feel this weight of judgment against us, okay, when we feel it, we always do. When we feel the weight of this judgment against us, we all slip into the slavery of self-salvation. Trying to appease the judge. And that judge might be our friends or our parents or our spouse or even ourselves. It doesn't matter. But we slip into the slavery of self-salvation, trying to appease the judge with hard work, good behavior, getting better, achievement, losing weight, and so on. Okay, we're trying to reduce the judgment that we feel against us. If I can just stay out of trouble and get good grades, maybe my mom and dad will finally approve of me. If I can overcome this addiction, then I'll be able to accept myself. If I can get thin, maybe my husband will think I'm beautiful. If I can make a name for myself and be successful, maybe I'll get the respect that I long for. Self-salvation projects. We talk a lot about self-salvation projects around here, and this is what I'm talking about, okay? When we feel, you don't even know perhaps that this is what's going on inside of you. You feel the weight of the demand, you hear the voice of accusation, you feel the judgment against you that you're not what you want to be, you're not what you should be. And you've got people all around you, people that you know and people that you don't know, all around you in some way, shape, or form communicating you're not enough. So what do you do? Okay, what do you do when that happens? Well, we slip into the slavery of self-salvation projects. If I can just do this, or if I can just become that, then maybe I can relieve the judgment against me. Maybe I can meet the demand that is being placed on me. We become our own savior in that regard. When we feel the demand, we become slaves to our attempts to meet the demand. And this demand that we feel is rooted in God's demand to be perfect. Be perfect as God is perfect. We don't realize that. We don't know that. This demand that we feel on the surface, that we try to meet on our own, okay, this pressure, this judgment that we feel against us, that we try to meet on our own, that we try to save ourselves from, is ultimately rooted in the fact that God made you, and His demand from you as His creature is that you be perfect as He is perfect. And all of the advertisements you see, all of the things in our culture that are trying to get you to buy their goods so that you can be happy and joyful, all of the things around us that are communicating you're not enough, is ultimately rooted in humanity's relentless pursuit for perfection. The relentless pursuit of happiness that accompanies perfection. Well, where does that come from? It comes from the fact that we are creatures made in the image of God, and God's demand of His creatures is that we be perfect as He is perfect. We feel it. And that plays itself out in 1,000 different ways in our lives. We spend our lives trying to get what only God can give. So, the gospel of grace announces that Jesus came to fulfill the law and acquit the guilty. He came to judge and be judged in our place. The demand maker became a demand keeper, and He died for me, a demand breaker. That's what this story is ultimately about. God making a demand, a crazy demand. Go kill your son. A crazier demand than go kill your son is be perfect. Be perfect. If you and I have any hope at all, it's not ultimately rooted in our progress. Okay, I've said this before. God does not grade on a curve. He's not saying, well, you're a lot better than you used to be. You've made progress, well done. The only thing that God accepts is infallible perfection. That's it. The only thing that God approves is infallible perfection. So as crazy as it sounds that God tells Abraham, go kill your son, as crazy of a demand as that is, that's not nearly as crazy as God saying, be perfect like me. That's really crazy, okay? And the place where we see God making a crazy demand and then meeting that demand is at the cross. That's where we ultimately see it. This demand maker, God, becomes a demand keeper, Jesus, and died for me, a demand breaker. I mean, listen, I wish that I could say, 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. How many of you, just raise your hand, how many of you have been successful in doing that this morning? Okay? How many of you have ever been successful in doing that? Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, Do it all, whatever you do it all to the glory of God. I mean, I wish that I could say everything I do is for God's glory. I can't. And either can you. What I can say is that Jesus' blood covers all of my efforts to glorify myself. Okay? God making a demand, God meeting that demand. I wish I could say that Jesus fully satisfies me, you know? I mean, I read that not long ago in someone's biography, the biography of a pastor. It was a short bio, it was an article that he wrote, and there was a short bio of this pastor, and, you know, I'm a husband, and I'm a father, and I'm a pastor, and I'm fully satisfied in Jesus. And I read it, and I said, no, you're not. I mean, you're not. And every one of us that reads that, it feels like a booming voice of law. Because I'm going, man, geez, he's fully satisfied in Jesus. I'm not. Man, you know? I wish I could say that Jesus fully satisfies me. I can't. Either can you. What I can say is that Jesus fully satisfied God for me. Okay? That's what I can say. God making the demand, God meeting that demand. Be fully satisfied in Jesus. I wish I could say that. Well, it's okay because Jesus fully satisfied me on your behalf. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. I try. I promise you I try. But I can't do it. Not everything, not all the time, not infallibly, not perfectly. It's okay, because Christ's blood covers all of your futile attempts to glorify yourself. I remember having a couple come and talk to me one time, trying to discern whether or not they should make a big move. They were debating on whether or not to move their family because of the husband's work from South Florida to the Northeast. And I said, have you been up there in the wintertime? Anyway, I said, you don't even need to pray about this. I mean, seriously, don't over-spiritualize this. It's snowy, all right? And they came to me and they said, we're really, really wrestling through this and we're praying through this and we really want to know God's will on this. And what we really want to ensure is that our motives are pure. And I said, you don't have to tell me anymore. They're not, okay? I mean, no one's are. I mean, seriously, pure motives, I mean, they can be more or less good or getting better, okay? But pure motives, there is no such thing as the experience of pure motives as sinful people, okay? Well, that's good news. Because if our pure motives, or if our ability to be fully satisfied in Jesus, or if our ability, our capacity to, whether we eat or drink or whatever we do it all to the glory of God all the time without interruption. I mean, can you imagine if that were on your shoulders? My shoulders? Thankfully, and this is what Jesus meant when he said in the Sermon on the Mount, I have not come to abolish the law. I have not come to remove the demand. I've come to fulfill it. So we can say this, as you've heard me say before probably, we're not saved apart from law. We're saved in Christ who perfectly kept God's law on our behalf. So when Jesus says, I have not come to abolish the law, I have not come to remove the demand or sweep it under the rug or say, well, you're trying, so you're in. I didn't come to do that. It's what Nick Lannon was talking about a couple weeks ago if you were here. We reduce the weight of God's law into something manageable that we can do ourselves. So be perfect becomes just try hard, okay? Don't lust becomes, well, not too much, okay? I'm just not too much. You know, I love the illustration he gave about the guy who had figured out how to kill the lust problem. Just don't look at other women, okay? And Nick said very honestly, I don't need eyes, to lust. I'm a sinner. Okay? I mean, we reduce the weight, the heaviness of the demand to something that we can do ourselves, something manageable. And yet what we discover here is that as long as we try and meet the demand ourselves, we perpetuate our slavery. We try to satisfy the judge. You know, there's this old New Yorker cartoon where a man is sitting with a woman and he says, I cannot promise you that I'll change, but I promise that I'll pretend to change. I mean, that's what we're left with, pretending. The moment we try to meet the demand, for the first thing we do is we reduce the demand. It's not be perfect, it's try hard. So we reduce the demand, and then we try on our own power to meet that demand. I'll just change, you know? I mean, I'll change and I'll try hard and I'll do my best to improve. And maybe that will silence the internal voice of accusation that I feel. We try on our own to do it ourselves. That's what we do. And we end up perpetuating our slavery. We end up consigning ourselves to a life of pretending, faking it. Deception, trying to convince ourselves that we are in fact pulling it off, when in fact we're not. Well, as long as we reduce the weight of the demand, we consign ourselves to slavish self-salvation projects. And we never experience the joy and the freedom that comes from God meeting the impossible demand that He has made on our behalf. See, Jesus came to satisfy the deep judgment against us once and for all so that we could be free from the judgment of God, from the judgment of others, and from the judgment of ourselves. He came to give rest to our efforts at trying to deal with the demands on our own. And this is what it means to be free from the law. When Paul talks about what it means to be free from the law, he means we're free from the uncarryable burden of having to meet the demand on our own, from having to make it, from having to do it. So, to silence the voice of accusation, it doesn't happen simply by losing weight, becoming nicer, improving yourself, getting a better reputation, all of those things that are manageable. Those are surface demands. Those are surface demands. There is an under-the-surface demand that gives birth to those surface demands that we feel. And that under-the-surface demand can only be met by an over-the-surface God who came to do for us what we could never, ever, ever do for ourselves. We don't need to live under the burden of trying to appease the judgment we feel. In Christ, the ultimate demand has been met. The deepest judgment has been satisfied. And this means that our identity is anchored not in the do of law, but in the done of gospel. And so as you've heard me say this before, and it's something I have to revisit each and every day in my own life as I continue to fail, as I continue to try and save myself by silencing the voice of internal accusation. I have to remember always that the internal voice, and all of us have it, that says, do this and live, only gets out-volumed by the external voice that says, it is finished. The outside voice is louder than the inside voice. So rest assured, okay? Before God, the righteousness of Christ is all we need. And before God, the righteousness of Christ is all we have. So when we celebrate communion, okay, when we take the Lord's Supper together, this is what we're celebrating. Whether you eat or drink, and whenever you eat or drink, this is Jesus saying to us through these common elements, I've rescued you. This is an it is finished meal, which is why we celebrate it. This isn't a funeral service, okay? You know, I grew up taking communion in churches, and I hated it because everyone wore black. The elders looked sour, and the guilt that was put on our shoulders to feel bad about ourselves. Okay, you're not taking communion rightly unless you feel terrible. Okay, and so it was just a depressing, morbid ceremony until I actually started reading the Bible and discovering what it is that communion actually does. It's a confirmation of God's promise that I've rescued sinners. You've been set free. If you're a slave, you've become a son. I have done for you what you could never do for yourself. So when the Apostle Paul says, before you come to the Lord's table, examine yourself, he says that because he wants us to go down deep, to look at the mess that's down there, and to realize no matter how hard I try, no matter what efforts I put forth, there is absolutely no way that I can save myself and set myself free. Thank God for Jesus. Thank God for Jesus. It's amazing. From time to time, okay, I will hear people say, okay, we get this stuff. Let's move on, I say, okay, let me just do sort of a rich young ruler test with you, all right? And we'll have a conversation. And I said, all right, so you're interested in getting a to-do list from me, the preacher. How about I give you Jesus' to-do list? Be perfect as I am perfect. Now put that in your pipe and smoke it, and just sit back, shut up, and thank God for Jesus, okay? I mean, seriously. Seriously, if you want a to-do list, listen, I hate to sound so crass, okay? But if you really want a to-do list, if you think that a to-do list is what you need most, I'll give you one. Be perfect, all right? Perfect. And as soon as you've hit perfection, come back. And then we'll stop talking about Jesus, okay? But until that time, which will not happen until the day you die or the day Jesus comes back, whichever comes first, we have to keep reminding ourselves that Jesus came to do for us what we could never do for ourselves. We have to keep reminding ourselves when you're going through difficult seasons, when you're going through painful trials, when you're going through seasons of confusion and disappointment and despair, you know what you need? You don't need a checklist. That's what Job's friends gave to Job. That's what they gave him. Okay, Job, we get it. Good people get good stuff and bad people get bad stuff, and you're clearly getting bad stuff, so what'd you do wrong? Clean yourself up so you can get the blessings back. Self-salvation. What we need are friends who continually remind us, it is finished. Your debt has been paid in full. Jesus has acquitted you. He has met the demand that God has made, and you've been set free. And that's what we celebrate. If you've never taken communion with us before, we come forward and take it. There'll be elders and pastors sprinkled throughout up front and up top in the balcony, ready to serve you. You'll come forward. The ushers will sort of guide you so you'll know when it's time to go, and you'll come with your family, gather around the elements with your family, and you'll take the bread and you'll dip it into the cup, and an elder or a pastor will remind you that it is finished. It's a time of remarkable celebration. And so let's ask God to help us, to give us eyes to see, to remind us of the promises that He has already fulfilled supremely in the person of Jesus, and pray that that would create increased faith so that when we come and commune with God in a very real and spiritual way, we're not simply remembering what Jesus has done. Jesus, by the power of the Holy Spirit, communes with us to remind us Himself that it is finished, that it's been paid in full.